It is such a pleasure to have you here with us today, Kevin Saunders. So tell us where you're from, and where you live currently, and then what you do for a living.
Hi, Bonnie. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am a high-end portrait artist and I live in San Antonio. I was born in Amarillo, but that's a long, bumpy and crooked road to get from Amarillo to San Antonio. Part of why I'm good at what I do now is I've done a zillion different things in past careers, and I've bumped into pretty much every type of person in context with the way they live. So I can size someone up and very quickly see who they are and have empathy for what their story is. Because as a portrait artist, my job is to find what they have to say and put that into a portrait that will tell that story for them for future generations.
I love it. So where did you get your inspiration from?
Well, that's a good question. Working a camera is very easy, really. You push the button at the right time and you get an image. And getting the exposure and the aperture is not that hard. However, my dad was my first real inspiration back in the 1960s, as he was a very gifted amateur photographer. And he would take me out and ask me to look at a scene and say, what's the shutter speed? What's the aperture? So I had to start actually observing in a very different manner than just opening my eyes and watching life go by. And so I have learned to see, and now at 65, I can do something about it. I take this as a calling. It chose me. I didn't choose it. But there aren't very many people that have set out in this day and age to make fine art portraits that will truly define folks. In fact, Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat have redefined humanity regarding who people are. And a free, quick snap, it doesn't cost you anything. You're not giving anything. It doesn't last. It lasts as long as you get the next snapshot. That's the value most people place on their image right now.
Right.
And the world has been tearing down institutions, particularly in the last 5 years, at an unprecedented rate. But in 2014, I saw a pathway in fine art portraits that I thought was important. And someone showed me the path, and the guy was real blunt and made me feel uncomfortable, but also made me look at myself in the mirror. And I realized that I could see like Yusuf Karsh in the last century, and I could see like John Singer Sargent in the century before. I had no idea, frankly, that I had this gift, but the more I started digging into it, I realized that there was something there. So I made a decision in 2014 to become this century's portrait artist and do the work that's required and the effort that's required to become the best of the best.
I love it. I mean, if you go to your website, it's just incredible. The images that you capture and the feeling, the emotion. And now tell us, you mentioned two of these, two, I guess, portrait artists that were part of your inspiration. Can you tell us a little bit about them for someone that's not
Sure.
familiar?
Well, the first one, Yusuf Karsh, was a guy who is a Canadian photographer. He created 7,000 portraits and was an apprentice in Boston, actually, for many years. And then all of a sudden, he was a photojournalist in Canada, and the Canadian government hired him to make a portrait of Winston Churchill. So on December 30th, 1941, and the timing is significant here because we'd already had December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Day, that involved the United States in the war with Japan, but we were not engaged in Europe. So Karsh set his equipment up in a hallway in a government office, and Churchill was having one meeting in one room. He came out a door, and Carr said, "Prime Minister, I'm supposed to take your portrait." And of course, Churchill hadn't been briefed, and he got mad, and there was a spirited discussion, let's say. And so finally, Churchill agreed to sit. And so Churchill was famous for having a big cigar and a glass of sherry pretty much all the time. And so he handed over the glass of sherry to his assistant, and he stood in front of this wall and still had the cigar in his mouth. And so Carr focused the scene, reached forward, grabbed the cigar out of Churchill's mouth, and snapped the shot. And it made him so mad
Oh,
that intensity is what became the portrait.
oh,
And Carr said, "I'm sorry, Prime Minister, I had to do it." And they kind of bonded afterwards, because anybody that had enough guts to do that earned Churchill's respect. So regardless, that portrait made the cover of Life magazine. And it, in many ways, helped change American sentiment to focus on supporting England rather than supporting Germany. Charles Lindbergh was the America First guy, and he was whispering in Roosevelt's ear for us to go and support Hitler. And we'd had a problem with England prior to World War II called the American Revolution. So we didn't really get along with England that well at the time either. And Roosevelt had a real problem. And the Queen of Denmark was whispering in his ear and suggesting that they use the Lend-Lease program, which ultimately they did. But Life magazine gave Roosevelt a kind of a clear lane to say it's okay to support England in this. And that became how we were involved in World War II. And the winners write the history books, and there you go. But what dawned on me was one portrait could have such power that it could drive a generation of people and inspire them. And I did not see that happening in Facebook and Instagram. And I did see that some people would feel this is so important that they would go through the effort to get in front of my camera, and they'd spend the money, and we'd create something that I call a movie with one frame. And so that's really what I'm trying to do with the portrait, is I have an empathy that makes it difficult for me to go out in public, but makes it very easy in my controlled studio environment to see where people are coming from emotionally. I call them signature portraits, but what I'm doing is I'm finding their signature, their emotional signature. And for some reason, I'm able to fairly quickly earn someone's trust, get them in front of the camera, have them emote something to me that's cool, and then I can put it in a portrait and let that become part of their story for 200 years in the future.
I love it. And it's such a beautiful piece. I mean, you do huge pieces. What is the largest piece that you've ever done?
Well, that's a good question. Before doing portraiture, I used to do big cityscapes that were composites of hundreds of images. So I have many images that are 40 and 50 feet large that still have perfect hyperrealism throughout. And so once I realized that that's kind of how I see, I adapted that over to my portraiture. So I offer portraits up to 120 inches or 10 feet tall. People might think that's excessive, but I recently did a life-size full-length portrait of a woman here in San Antonio, and she's 5'7", and in heels, she's taller than that. So with the headroom and footroom around the portrait, a life-size portrait's 96 inches. So people aren't used to seeing things that size now. Back in the Gilded Age, in the late 1800s, John Singer Sargent made portraits that size regularly. In fact, his portrait of Madame X, which was one of his most famous portraits, was 91 inches tall.
That's a beautiful. Oh, yes. And there's more to this story too, right? The strap.
Oh, Madame X, yeah. So Americans are not the only country that's gone through puritanical phases. In the late 1800s in Paris, they were experiencing that same phenomenon. And so Madame X was a Louisiana socialite who went over to Paris to sit for John Singer Sargent. And she was leaning against a table and her elbow was bent provocatively. And he painted one of the straps on her dress down over her shoulder. And it totally scandalized everyone. And it caused Sargent to hightail it out of Paris and come to America. He wound up repainting the strap up because he couldn't take the heat. Although it made him so uncomfortable, he figured this was one of his best works, but he didn't sell it for 30 years later.
Wow. Wow, that's so incredible. So we were talking right before this started, and you tell us about your previous career path and how everything evolved.
Well, I've had a bunch of them.
Yeah.
I am a classic example of someone who challenged authority and discovered there were consequences to doing so. I challenged my teachers in grade school and high school, dropped out of high school, drove 18-wheelers for a few years before eventually going to college. And I graduated from college at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, pre-med with an emphasis on anatomy. So it's not that I couldn't handle academia. I did not like it when people didn't challenge me, and I would give them what they gave me. So a lazy teacher would promote a apathetic response on my part. And back in the day, they called people like me underachievers, which did nothing to help solve the problem. So I wound up setting out on my own, and I developed a fabulous work ethic driving 18-wheelers, and that has helped me to this day. I also learned how to see and size up a situation very quickly. When I was driving trucks, I dressed like I do now. And although I'd end up in Port Elizabeth, New Jersey, and on the docks and hanging out with the most salty dock workers you can imagine, but I never had problems with people. I always gave them the benefit of the doubt, and they seemed to always give me the benefit of the doubt. And I think the reason for that is people like that are very street smart, and they can see very quickly who's full of it and who's for real. Remarkably, taking that back to my portraiture now, 3-year-olds and dogs are the same way. They're very street smart. They can tell if somebody's friend or foe. So it's funny how things come back. But anyway, I drove 18-wheelers, went to college, was in the insurance agency business that my family was in for a while and hated it. And we, by mutual agreement, got out of that career. I raced bicycles full time for a few years. I tried to get in the Olympics in sailboat racing and did very well. I got up to 11th in the nation in the Finn class, which was a single-handed sailboat class. I started an aviation manufacturing company with an awful partner, and I learned a tough lesson about who you go into business with and the consequences of that. But I learned about high end. I learned about high accountability manufacturing. I learned how to manage a team. And I've been an aerospace industrial designer and designed some crazy and interesting things. I had a custom bicycle business for a while that was a great idea until the recession hit. And I realized that a really nice bike is great for the person who buys it. But when you're on a bike ride with other people, everybody gossips, and somebody comes up in a $400 bike. I'm like, oh man, that's a cool bike. I've never seen anything like that. How much did it cost? $35,000. Holy moly, I can't believe it, that I could buy a car for that. So the person that went to the trouble and spent the money to get a perfect bicycle is being put down by someone on a cheap bike who's willfully ignorant of what effort that person went through. So I had the right idea, but I was in the wrong business.
Gotcha.
So I put a photography studio in the bike studio because I realized that place was a support system for the internet, because San Antonio is not a high-end town. And I sold most of my bicycles around the world. And the recession hit and the business tanked, and I sucked it out for a while. And in 2012, I started my photography studio and went into the architectural photography business and products. And I did some headshots, and but I built a neat career out of doing big building, cityscapes, hyperrealism. And I did some other contemporary fine art with an orchid project that was also hyperrealism. That's on my KGS Studios website. But in 2014, I met this guy who was a long form photojournalist, and he'd been all over the world. He owned one of Cartier-Bresson. Of course, I can't remember now. Henri Cartier-Bresson. He owned one of those guys, that guy's cameras, and was invited to be in the Magnum group. Magnum is the photography group in New York where all the street shooters are members of. It's truly the best of the best, and he turned them down. Oh, but regardless, this guy saw something in my work, and he said, Kevin, this is some of the best work I've seen in the world, but you're not putting important enough things in front of your camera. And it took me about 6 months of him harping on me for me to realize, after looking at the real masters from Sargent to the Dutch masters 400 years ago, all the way back to the hand paintings in the caves 200,000 years ago. This stuff's important to people, and it resonates, and people have a strong desire to create a legacy during their lifetime, but then having it follow them for future generations. And everybody now has gone to Facebook and Instagram and digital. And if you drop your phone in the toilet and you lose your pictures, who cares? You get another phone and start over. And that didn't set well with me. So I decided I'm going to be the wall portrait guy. And I can pick up where Karsh left off, where Sargent left off, and be the guy in this century that most people still won't care about, frankly, but a few people will care quite a bit. And that's enough. Like Seth Godin says, you want to build the smallest viable audience of people that resonate with your work. And so that's now what my life's mission is.
No, it's incredible. I mean, I love what you do. And I love the fact that, we're actually going to do a shoot this Friday, and we're actually going to bring our dog, and we've already got our outfits picked out. And I'm really excited about the experience. It's incredible. And just visiting your website, you get an idea of what it's like, but I can't wait to truly do it.
Well, you'll enjoy it, and I think your dog will too. Dogs are people too, and I learned early on that if anyone wants to bring a pet in, they're part of the family, and they're very, very welcome here.
Oh, thank you. Well, so how long have you been doing this?
Well, portraits, I've been doing portraits for 8 years at this level. I did portraits before when people would ask, and for years people said, this is what you ought to do, but it never resonated until this guy beat me about the head and shoulders in 2012. I'm sorry, 2014. So 2014 to 2022, that's 8 years. And, a doctor can learn a lot in 8 years. The I the principal trombonist of the Chicago Symphony told me one time that anybody that in intense focus can become an expert in 4. So I've spent 8 years with this specific goal of wanting to be the best of the best. I've overlaid this with things like my Olympic campaign, where people are trying very hard to be the best of the best. And this is an interesting time to bring in a story about that Olympic campaign. I was in the bond business and I absolutely hated it. I made tons of money, but I hated the business. I didn't like anything about it. And I raced locally, and the Olympic Yachting Committee would give people the Finn sailboat for a year if you'd sail it. And I lived in Little Rock at the time. I didn't put too much thought into it because I just wanted to get out of that business. So in 1989, December of 1989, I went up to Rhode Island and got a boat in the middle of winter and drove it down to Miami to the Olympic Training Center there. And plop, I was in the middle of, there were 75 full-time professional sailors all aiming at one Olympic slot. And it was a real baptism by fire.
Wow.
But the goal setting and achievement and process of doing this was an incredible gift. And I remember the Olympic coach talking about folks that win the Olympic trials, but then they get to the big show and they melt down.
Yeah.
And they set all of their goals to win the Olympic trials. And then now they won, but they didn't define what's the next step. And so now they're in a foreign country with weird food and journalists and foreigners everywhere. And a lot of them just can't handle the pressure. So I realized that you need to set your goals all the way out from day one. So that's why I make a brash statement of wanting to be known as the portrait artist of the 21st century, because Karsh, if you look on karsh.org, it says the photographer of the 20th century. And Sargent was the most sought after guy in the 19th century. So it's a big claim. However, I've been around people like this. I work very well with big shots and leaders. They don't scare me. And in fact, the more they give me, the better I give back to them. And so I'm prepared for this next part of my life. And I'm 65, and I think I've got 20 to 30 years left in me to earn that right of being known as that once I'm no longer here.
Oh, that's incredible. I love it. I love this. What sparks your inspiration? Like when you're doing the photo, or just inspiration in general for this?
I have no idea. It's a gift. It's a gift. It chose me. All I know is when I meet someone, I'm completely engaged to help tell their story. It's very simple, very basic, very primal. I'm there for them, and they, in time, mostly learn to trust me to create something that will define them for future generations. It's a very big deal. It's a much deeper thought process than a Instagram selfie.
I can tell you truly love this. This is your passion. How does it?
No doubt. It's just like the Blues Brothers. I'm on a mission from God, but that's what a calling is. So nothing's going to get in the way. My wife of 32 years, who's a retired nurse, is devoted to helping me achieve my goal. And I'm extraordinarily grateful for the opportunity to do this.
Congratulations. 36 years is a long time. So
32, but it'll be 36
32.
in 4 years.
Oh, sorry. So what does your typical day look like?
They're all the same. I get up about 5, and I have a remote team. So some of my team is in Europe, and some of it is in India, and some of it's in the Philippines. And so I'm on the computer between 5 and 6 in the morning. And then I bring my coffee to my wife when she wakes up at 7. And then I hit the gym, and then I come into work. And then by 5 or 6 in the evening, I'm a goner. And then I spend the evening with my wife. And I do that 7 days a week. So it's a kind of a cloistered existence, but the studio was devastated in COVID, and I am not about to let the COVID lockdown keep me away from my goals. But
So
portrait studios, you can imagine, restaurants took it hard, but people still need to eat. So folks figured out a way to use restaurants. Many folks are not seeing that now's the time you need to document yourself with your act together, not crying in your beer.
right.
So my mission now is to wake people up to say, hey, this isn't going to be, you're not going to remember this time in history 20 years from now, like you're experiencing it now. So it's a very visionary prospect to create a portrait. And we are being detrained on having vision. Maybe it's always been this way, I don't know. But most people's vision is, let's go doom scroll on your phone, and then in the evening doom scroll the news, and then wake up in the morning and doom scroll the next day. And then that's, people become very passive, and they don't really think much for themselves when they're in that mindset.
I see. What is the farthest that you've actually traveled doing portraits? You have a mobile studio.
I just put together a portable studio over the last 2 years. That's a fabulous question, because San Antonio pre-COVID was one of the premier destination places in Texas and in the country. For a romantic weekend getaway, it cannot be beat. But then COVID came, and I realized that it's not going to be a destination city, at least in the near term. So I duplicated my studio and created the ability to go anywhere in the world. And this spring, I took it to Miami, and it was the first time we were able to do our shakedown and proof of concept. And I did some portraits in Miami, found a fabulous studio in the design district there, and proved that I can take all of my gear for my black and white studio, which is much more equipment intensive than the color studio, but I can bring them both and create the same level of quality anywhere in the world as if someone would come here. And the reason I say anywhere in the world is I have a trailer that I can take it to Miami, New York, or LA. But if someone wants to bring me to Davos, Switzerland, to the World Economic Forum, or to the Monaco Yacht Show, or to Dubai, or Hong Kong, or Shanghai, I can go there just as easily. It just takes a big jet.
Wow. That's so exciting. So exciting. So what's the farthest that you've traveled so far?
Well, Miami's the farthest. It's going to be bigger steps to get someone to send a jet, because I can't go in a Gulfstream. It's got to be a Boeing business jet or bigger. And so there aren't that many people that are willing to do something like that. However, those people do exist.
Yes.
And what I've discovered in my little short portrait journey is most people look at what my work is as so excessive compared to Facebook that it's unimaginable. However, on the other side, the people that really want stuff like this, they are what I'm sure you've heard this term, underserved class. If somebody wants a portrait like this, who are they going to go to?
Right.
And so what I've found is this bizarre dichotomy of people where on one hand, someone spending a couple of $100s for a frame that blows their mind. And on the other hand, someone spending $100,000 plus getting me there, that's nothing, because the value of their time and the value of their legacy is so much more than that. And frankly, they make a lot more money too. Then this is just part of what they do. And they're delighted that someone actually cares enough that would go to the effort to make this happen for them.
Oh, I love it. I love it. This is amazing. Well, so what is your favorite piece that you've done? Do you have a favorite?
Well, my favorite piece is the one that works. And so it's bizarre. I delivered a portrait over the weekend, and it was a woman who came in who's an engineer, but her husband was a fighter pilot who got shot down in Vietnam and spent 7 years in the Hanoi Hilton with John McCain. And he survived, and he got out. And he met her after he was, released. But this guy had an iron will, and he was a good husband. And he was so old that he couldn't be in the portrait. But on my larger portraits, I take them to people's homes and hang them for them. And so on Saturday, he was well enough that I could actually go and hang the portrait, because it had been months. He was too sick for me to even go do it. So I came in there and opened up the portrait, and he saw his bride, and he started crying, and he goes, "This is the best investment I've ever made in my life."
Oh.
And so for that moment, that was the best portrait I'd ever done. That's why I can't just say I have a favorite, because I give 100% to every one of them. And if it's a good outcome, that's something extraordinary.
I can go on your website and I can see how that is hard to decide, because I see so many and I'm like, oh, that's my favorite. That's my favorite. Yeah, incredible work. And I love the one of the young girl wearing her quinceañera dress.
Oh, the quinceañera?
Yes.
Yes, she came in from Dallas, and she was a very, very mature young woman. And what's so funny now, moms see that, because I have her hanging in my studio as well. And they look at that portrait and they say, "Oh, I didn't look like that when I was 15. So, young women mature so quickly. It's kind of shocking when you see it in something as significant as in this case, which is a 60-inch by 50-inch portrait. It's astounding.
Oh, I love it. It's beautiful. So what would you say has been the most challenging for you?
Oh, well, the most challenging ones are where people don't give me the benefit of the doubt, because on a portrait is like a movie with one frame. And so for the time that the shutter is open, and when I'm using the color strobe lights, that's a 500th of a second. That person has to be completely engaged for a 500th of a second. And if they're not, it shows. If they don't trust me, it shows. If anything's wrong, it shows. And so I have that moment, that decisive moment, to get two things into the camera. One, the emotion, and two, enough information that I can do my artistry on my own time. And like I said, I was pre-med in college with an emphasis on anatomy. I've studied anatomy for 40 years, so I know how to tweak and push and tug and do stuff artistically, because I know what the underlying structures are. I didn't go quite as far as Michelangelo did and have cadavers dug up so I could dissect them, but I have studied anatomy a lot. And so I really do know how people are put together. But back to this emotion thing, this is what separates me from the hand painters now. Hand painters work off snapshots. and they have to guess what the emotion is. The subject is not in front of them. So for me, the subject actually is in front of them, and I'll talk to someone for half an hour. I'll laser beam them. I'll figure out their angles. I'll work very hard to have them give me the benefit of the doubt. And if they do, then an extraordinary portrait will happen. And if they don't, it'll be pretty ho-hum.
And I'm guessing it's even more of a challenge because we're talking about, doing a portrait for one person. But what if you have, two people and a pet, or you've got the family? So
then it becomes a multivariable equation. So for one person or two, I try to get the portrait in 4 shots or less. If there's a dog, dogs are very smart. Cats are just as smart. So I try to get the portrait in the first try, because dogs will figure out very quickly, I move behind that big shiny thing, and then there's going to be lightning. And so they're very smart on stuff like that. And 3-year-olds are the same way. So we do everything we can to try to get it in the first shot. Photographers will take 200, 300, 400 images in a portrait session and then try to find the winner from that. I confess I used to do that too when I was learning, and I apologize to anybody out there who may hear this who happened to be in front of my camera at that time. But now I don't want to torture anyone with that, because there is you may have read that when photography was invented, that people, particularly in indigenous cultures, were terrified of photographs because they thought that you were stealing their souls. And I don't know if that's the case or not, but it brings up a point that you're taking something from someone. And I don't want to take anything. I want to create something. I want to make something. So it's a very different thought process. I got off track there a little bit, but
I love it.
It's part of the why here.
So what would you want listeners to know most about you and your path? And what if they want to do the same thing? What would be your advice?
If someone wants to be a portrait artist, then they need to define what they want. In today's world, you can get a fancy new camera. You can go to moo.com and get a business card that says you're a professional photographer, and bam, there you are. And if you take enough shots, even a blind hog finds an acorn now and again, you'll get some good ones. What I have had to do is I had to learn my craft, and I spent tens of thousands of hours and tens of thousands of photographs, and I learned on my own how to do this stuff. And so if you want to do what I do, my business plan's on the website. I tell people exactly what I do. In fact, you've heard of Tabasco sauce, right?
Yeah.
You know, they publish their recipe.
I had no idea.
They've been around for 150 years, and they say, here's our 3 ingredients. Here's how we do it. It's very difficult to do. If you want to beat us at our own game, have at it.
Wow. That's
so I always encourage people to, if you want to do this, great. But I use a view camera. It's not a DSLR, and there's a reason for that. The lenses are better, and the shutter's mechanical. So when you have your dog in here, there's not going to be any delay. When I open up the shutter and the light goes off, we're going to be ahead of that dog, because they can hear the mirror popping up before the shutter opens, and they can react quickly enough to where by the time the mirror's up and the shutter's open, they're already doing something stupid. So I went back to the traditional form of cameras that they used 100 years ago, because it slowed me down. And so I have to be much more deliberate And if someone wants to do what I did, I encourage them to try. They're not going to see the same way I am. Their
Right.
work won't look like mine. And I'm certainly not threatened. That most people, when they want to get into this industry, go the other way. And they are like, well, I got a camera, so now I'm going to get into the market by undercutting the prices of everybody else. And so with everybody undercutting each other, it becomes what is known as the race to the bottom. And so now, particularly in the commercial photography world, the prices are so cheap, people can't make a living. And buyers are used to paying nothing. I know of many wedding photographers that when they do the wedding portrait, the cost of the venue, the cost of the dress, the cost of the hair and makeup are all paid for, and the cost of the photographer doesn't get paid.
Oh,
Of the
wow.
whole, all the pieces of the chain, that's the least paid part of the whole equation. So I realized that for me to make a living at what I do, I have to be the best of the best. And I'm going to have to be willing to pay the price in the interim period where I'm not known around the world. And then I have to generate something from nothing. And that's something that I'm happy to tell people how I did it. But I've found that the difference between world-class and not is people are either unable, but usually they're unwilling to do what is required. So the concert pianist Horowitz, such a fabulous piano player, someone came up to Horowitz one time and said, "Maestro, I'd do anything if I could play the piano as good as you." And he said, "Well, would you practice 8 hours a day for 20 years?"
Wow. Yeah.
So I'm 65 and I work an 80-hour week right now, 7 days a week. How many other people would do that? Because I have to market nationally and internationally, and I don't have the budget to hire a big PR firm and market nationally and internationally. I got to do it myself. Does that hold me back? No. The only thing that could is my marriage, but I'm so grateful my wife supports what I do. And so I'm able to do something like this with a clear conscience.
So what would be the final thing that you would say, no matter what profession, anyone that wants to just chase their dream or just jump in and start something new, what would you say to them?
I'd say a couple of things. One, go for it. Two, you're going to fail. So fail hard and fail fast and learn from it. And three, learn from it.
I
Because
love it.
what most people do is what Einstein and others said was the definition of insanity, is doing the same thing every day with the expectation of a different outcome. And so I've had to reinvent myself a gazillion times. And I don't look at the failures as failures. I look at them as learning opportunities, and I'm a little bit closer to success. And artists typically die broke. I'm not sure if I'll reach my goal until after I'm dead. I have no idea, but I do think that the world needs to have someone that cares enough to document their leadership. And I've made that commitment, and that's what I'm going to do.
I love it. And now if someone's interested, because you do corporate photos, you do family photos, friends photos, anything, you do portraits. How do they book a session with you or reach out to you?
Well, kgsstudios.com is the website. And I do my portraits in a studio for a couple of reasons. An environmental portrait has something other than one of my only canvas backdrop in it, but it may be a park, it may be a bridge, it may be a tree or something, but that has to carry compositional weight. It's also very difficult if you're outside and there's mosquitoes and wind and sun and you're sweating like crazy and there's people onlookers, and how are you going to compose yourself and give that emotion to the camera, particularly if it's a couples shot? It just blows me away how many engagement shots are out in some place and it's awkward and there's just, but that's what the other guys do. I have one backdrop, it enhances skin tones. I had it custom made. People come to my studio or I bring my studio to them, and then we create something that is timeless and traditional. And if people like that, then I can be the best possible solution. And if they don't like that, then that's okay too. Because frankly, most people would prefer the family in the park and pay $100 or $50, and then that's that. And that's totally okay.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and, giving up your precious time to do this. It's been such an honor and such a pleasure. And I'm so excited. I can't wait until Friday.
I can't wait to see you, your fiance, and your fur baby. And we're going to have an amazing experience. And thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit about what I do. And I hope that your audience will appreciate what you do for them.
Thank you.